All right, welcome, folks. It's good to see folks coming through the virtual door. I'm going to change over, put my AirPods in. So this is not being sponsored by Apple. Alex, how you doing? How you feeling?
Good. Excited.
Awesome.
Energized.
Yes. All right, we'll give it maybe another minute to let folks make their way. I don't know where folks are, but it was, for me, a lovely day in New York City. Did you go outside at all, Alex?
Nope.
Cool. Was it because you were preparing a webinar today?
Yeah, that's totally what it is. Fall and winter are just not my seasons. The cold hurts my body, so I tend to stay home more often.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Today felt like an exceptional day, perhaps too exceptional given global warming patterns, but it was what it was. I appreciate it. All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Very nice to be here in virtual community with you. My name is Cardozy Jones. I am the founder and CEO of True North EDI. Alex?
And I am Alex Gonzalez, and I am one of the consultants and facilitators at True North.
So I am very lucky to be here with Alex. Alex and I met, we met in 2008. So about 11, 12 years ago. And we were in a master's program for applied theater. So we were both in different senses like theater babies. But more importantly, the applied theater program was constantly asking us to think about questions and criticality and the intersections of oppression and what it means to engage groups around themes and concepts and topics around oppression. But I do miss being in person, so we could kind of like do some of the activities that we can't do now.
Mm-hmm.
So very happy to be here with you. This is Sharing, Ceding, and Yielding, Exploring Equitable and Responsive Transitions of Power. This is our second session in our webinar series called Designing Through Equity. And we'll talk more about that, but this, to just give some sense of expectations, this really is about what does it look like to design equitable and responsive processes. We've seen a lot of, I think, movement and shifts and innovations as it relates to what power looks, feels, and sounds like organizations, but certainly we don't have all the answers. We do have very specific thoughts around what it means to create processes that are imbued with values, that are imbued with equity. So before we begin, we're just going to offer a kind of little of an envisioning activity here. So we're asking that you reflect on a time in your life when you felt like you were a contributing and valued part of a collective. A time in your life when you felt like you were part of a contributing, you felt like you were a contributing and valued part of the collective. What did it look like? What did it feel like? What did it sound like? And as you think about that, what aspects would you want to recreate, either in life, in your organization? What aspects would you want to reimagine? Nothing is perfect, right? So what can we take with us? What should we leave behind? What do we want to surrender? That's a big part of our work at True North EDI, thinking about inheritances and just going through and clarifying what things we want to move forward with and what things we want to leave behind. When I think about this question, I think about going back to our theater conversation. When theater is good, it is so good. And I mean being part of theater, being a participant in the theater making process. I am/was part of a theater community that the pillars of which were fun, community, and creative self-expression. And we always revisited and regrounded constantly in those values. And Alex, I'm going to ask you for a time that you experienced for your viewers as well, on the spot. But so we always revisited those values. And we, over time, I think, realized that we didn't live in a vacuum, right? So you may have fun, you might have community, you might have creative self-expression, but we're still always pushing up against and being pushed on by societal context, right? Identity, power, history. So that organization began with a white male executive director, primarily all white board. And today it's the executive director is a woman of color, and it's a mostly BIPOC board. And they're still working to refine. But there was a part of that experience for me that if I could take it with me, one of the recommendations we have is to look to other aspects in the world when we think about what power can look like. So be it nature, be it the arts, be it family, what can we find? What can we bring with us? There are examples out there. Alex, do you have anything in mind?
Yeah, actually, I would say with a particular approach that a principal at a charter school in East Harlem I was working at took. At the time, I was an after school program director, and I did a lot of after school for many years before going to that school. And after school was often treated as like the babysitters of the school, right? And never really taken as seriously as daytime school. But this particular school, the principal was actually really invested in the value of just community, right? And making sure that she was doing everything she could to cultivate and expand community within our work culture, right? And not just like saying we're here to just get our paycheck and then check ourselves at the door, right? And so really made it personal. And so whenever she regularly had Friday staff meetings to talk about student culture and like even individual students and how they were progressing or what they were having challenges with, or what their families were even having challenges with. And instead of only talking to the daytime teachers, she would bring in everybody, operational folks, after school folks, and we would all be able to give some insight on what we knew about this individual or this class. And that felt really affirming because it made me feel like a broader part of the community or an integral part of the community, as opposed to just like, we're just after school, we just brush the kids off on you when we are done with them, so right. I think really important value.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. It's because it sounds like, which is what we say all the time, is that the mission of that school would not be complete or as healable without the insights and the perspectives of the after school programming staff.
Absolutely.
Right. Thank you. So, we're always looking at our past experiences and considering what aspects of those experiences can we take forward. And we'll continue to do that as we think about this conversation around what power looks like, what redesigning and reimagining power structures and power dynamics look like. And before we do, I will, Alex, do you want to just let people know like what they can expect today?
Yeah, so like Cardozi was mentioning, we are going to get a little deeper into True North's particular approach to the work that we do, but so much of it is values-based, right? So we're really going to be examining of what does it look like when we actually have a values-based leadership approach. Many organizations you see will have values on their website and talk about them in their marketing and so on and so forth, but may not always be excelling at embodying those values or really taking a hard look at like, how does it look like in action? Values are more than feelings, right? They are the way that we move through the world and build relationships and so on and so forth. And we're going to be doing that through a case study. We found it would be helpful as opposed to just throwing a bunch of like recommendations and strategies all at once, that we are going to bring this case study that we created that I feel like really embodies a lot of different organizations we've worked with into one, right? Just like so many different issues and topics that we have seen come up in our work, and created this imaginary case study. And as we move through the case study, we're going to be talking about what kind of approaches would we take? What kind of questions would we ask? What kind of, actions could we initiate in order to meet the needs that are coming up? And then we're going to close out with some time for folks to be able to ask some questions and us give some answers or provide some offerings for those who are just interested in looking at, shifting the leadership approaches within their communities or organizations.
Right, thank you. So supplemental to this, the webinar, we are going to share with you a link in the chat. The link takes you to a resource that complements the webinar. It has, as we go through the case study, as we go through kind of the framework that we're offering up as a process for designing responsive and equitable transition, that'll be in there as well as those questions and examples that Alex named as well. So you're welcome to refer to that workbook whenever you need to, and certainly after you leave here, you're welcome to refer back to it and share it. After the webinar is over tomorrow, I believe you should receive a recording of the webinar and also a recording of the webinar. I think that's all you. I think that's all you get. So let's jump in. Let's jump in.
So part of what we wanted to do before even getting into the case study is really get an idea of the context of where we are at now. And what you'll see on your screen is a variety of newspaper, do we still have newspapers?
Do we still call it that?
Online periodicals that kind of give insight of where we are at culturally in regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm going to read these out loud just in case folks have challenges reading on the screen. And I'm going to start from the upper left-hand corner and work across this first row and then move on to the second row. So the first one says, at theaters, push for racial equity leads to resignations and restructuring. To fight systemic racism, CEOs and high-profile professionals should step down and offer their jobs to people of color. After years of talking about diversity, the number of Black leaders at US companies is still dismal. Why are there still so few Black executives in America? The racism of the, quote, hard to find qualified Black candidate trope. And resignation can be an act of leadership. Diversity needs more step-aside examples. And so what we are seeing here is, what we're exploring and seeing is all of the ways in which racism and inequities show up in our culture, right? I think we see a lot about our justice system, but we don't always see all the, what might seem minute ways or intricate ways or invisible ways in which racism is still deeply pervasive in our culture and how we build community and build organizations. And so we're here to highlight that there is still just structurally, culturally, socially, deep issues within our places of work, within our community organizing, where there's this disconnect between what we call white supremacy and racial equity or equity in general, including gender, sexual orientation, and all of these other things. And so this really highlights for us like the work that we have to continue doing and where there are still major inequities, particularly for people of color, Black people, Indigenous people. And so this is just a little context of what led us here today to start examining leadership, power dynamics, and how we can start restructuring or reimagining them.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I think this also really points to the nuance of issues that are in abundance that we're seeing. And the reason why there is no one size fits all. Here's how you fix it. Here's what it looks like to ... right? The process that we'll be going through today is deeply looking at what's actually happening specifically within the context of the organization, what's happening within the context of the world, right? That's going to ultimately lead to the values process through which we decide how we might rebuild or redesign what power, what leadership looks like. So we're going to be thinking about, as we move through today, there's kind of three paradigms or you know, like buckets, if you will, that we're thinking through. And so the one is just power, right? What do we mean when we say power? Call and response, we'll be looking at that aspect of our work we see calls for action and we see responses to calls for action. And we're going to be looking at a little bit of that as a kind of a two-part paradigm. And then this idea of sharing, ceding, and yielding, right? What do we actually mean by that? And what does it offer us? What does all of this offer us in terms of really knowing what do we mean when we say, not just in this webinar, but as an organization, what do we mean when we say? What language are we going to use to guide processes? Are we on the same page about that language? And so we'll just move on from there. So in terms of power, we're thinking about power as a spectrum defined by individual and community influence, impact, and agency. In our work, equity, diversity, inclusion, or for us, interdependence work, power sits within a context of historical and systemic inequity. In fact, everything that we do sits in the context of historical and systemic inequities. Right? We're not looking at power in a vacuum. We're looking at power as how it intersects with history and with kind of socio-political context. And there's also, we want to be clear that power, we're not suggesting that you can eliminate it, right? Kind of like energy, right? It's gonna get transformed into something else. But it certainly does have more shapes, more manifestations, more forms than we've been led to believe. And so we're not going to go too deeply into that here, but they are things that we talk about in our work with folks. And then Alex, going to talk about some of the calls we've seen and what they look like.
Yeah, so oftentimes these calls are either by community, the people we serve, or staff, more often than not. And what we've seen is realizations sparked by external events and or societal movements and shifts. So last year, there was so much forward movement in people trying to start engaging in anti-racism work after what happened with George Floyd. People started taking EDI work more seriously and prioritizing it more. Internal fed upness, which I think is just like such a great term. It feels so simple, but so accurate, in which you just get to this place where you're just like, I'm done. I'm at capacity for how much harm or difficulty that I can take in this space, right? Because we are human beings in our places of work. We can't check ourselves at the door. And so there's just so much our spirits and minds and bodies can take within our places of work. And then persistent or spike of harmful actions on the part of leaders, right? So when we're talking about power dynamics, we are so used to this like triangle shape of hierarchy and power, in which there's a small group of people who hold power, and then they're just weighing down on the rest of the pyramid, sometimes forcibly, aggressively, or even violently slow. So we're hearing more staff and more communities members saying, no, this is not working for me anymore. It is actually abusive and harmful, and we need to put a stop to it.
Thank you. And Alex, I'm sharing my screen. If you could check the chat for anything I might be missing, that'd be great. Yeah. So in terms of the responses that we've seen responses rooted in authentic listening, right? Really, like, I'm hearing you, let's talk more about it. Let spaces where deeper listening prevails, at least in the beginning. We've seen responses that are words oriented and or responses that are action oriented. Sometimes it's this is either or, sometimes this is both and. We obviously want always a both and balance approach to things, but we do want to recognize that these are two different things, right? I hear you, and here's what I think about what you're saying versus here's how I will change, here's how we will change, here's what we can do or I can participate in to create change. And then we've also seen responses that are defensive and combative. There are several examples, always, but certainly in recent history, where organizations that have been called out or where staff or stakeholders have disrupted, disrupted the culture to call out racial inequity or to call out inequity in general. And the response has been like hammer thrown down, refusal to talk about it, refusal to change. And quite frankly, I think I may share this with you, Alex. For our work is about making sure that the inside matches the outside, right? Are your values that you declare to have, your beliefs that you declare to have, are they matched up? Are they aligned with your actions in the world, your actions as an organization? If they are, if you say that our values are money, bottom lines, our values are work harder for more and faster, and your actions line up with that, you're not our client, and that's okay. Right? And you're honest with the people who work for you about who you are, and you give them the right to choose. Right? We build in a little bit of consent around that, and I think we can talk about this more. And I know, Alex, you have very specific opinions about this. That we want organizations where consent is a value, even when it's like, again, you are who you say you are, and I don't choose you. As opposed to, you're saying one thing, but you're doing something else completely. And am I crazy? Am I kind of misreading? Right? And that creates, I think it's a tactic, oftentimes. So we're looking for that alignment. So the final kind of thing, paradigm we're thinking about, and these are things that we're seeing being grappled with in terms of what it looks like on the other side of shifting and power changes. I'll read the first one. Alex, you want to take the second one?
Yep, no problem.
Cool. So when we think about sharing, right, sharing of power, we're looking at power as a shared resource, the bulk of which should not be held in concentration within one individual or even a small group. And it isn't always the amount of people, but just the conditions and circumstances and practices around those people. They're agreements created by and for the collective around division of responsibilities and inclusive decision making, right? So power as a shared resource.
With ceding, this is, I feel like, a part of that call and response, right? And this is part of the response section, in which whoever holds the greatest amount of power, whether that be an executive director or board member, decides to step down or aside, right? They feel they are not a good fit for the mission or for the work or for the communities that they are serving. So they decide to step back or step aside. They relinquish a portion of or all of the power to move into a position or practice that does not hold the majority of influence or decision-making. So there's also, some of the headlines we highlighted was talking about people step on from their positions of power. Something we'll explore in the case study is that this doesn't always mean that you have to completely leave the organization or the work that the organization is doing. Again, we're here to reimagine what leadership or community decision-making can look like, but part of that is stepping down and relinquishing some aspect of power.
Thank you. And then yielding is interesting. In so many ways, we're not offering you, here are the true Webster's definitions of sharing, ceding, and yielding. We're offering kind of language that serves the context of the conversation. So yielding typically means change as a result of being bending to pressure. It means to bend. And so when we think about yielding, we're thinking about it a little bit differently. So this is a power change that is the result of pressure. We're offering that it creates a space of tension and harm. So based on, given the conversations that, that Alex and I certainly have, and the conversations that we have within True North EDI, we're asking to not reach this point, right? What is it? This is yielding happens when you try to hold on to power, you try to combat, you try to protect, you try to defend, and you finally just decide to acquiesce, right? Or to bend to the will of whoever is asking for the change. But the space that creates can be so harmful and so damaging. And so we're actually offering up that we don't want people to get to the yielding stage. And this isn't a linear stage at all. These aren't linear stages at all. But in terms of yielding, as far as what we've seen it create, it can be really harmful. And so we're offering, if you are a leader or for leaders or people who are in positions of power, what's on the other side of the clamoring to maintain power, the clamoring to what often could happen, gaslighting, scapegoating, right? So that's part of the context that we're building today, and that we'll think about as we move through the webinar. All right.
Yay, case study. So we are going to move into the case study, which, Cardozi, correct me if I'm wrong, is in the workbook as well.
The case studies in the workbook as well, yes.
Yeah, so folks can read along in the workbook or on the screen, but I'm going to read it out loud for us, just so that we're all on the same page about what this narrative is. And then we're going to start moving through what processes we might engage in this particular scenario.
And I want to add that we're doing it a little bit differently than, if you were here last week, I don't know what day this is, for the first webinar that myself and Aaron Levy facilitated, where we applied a framework to a case study. In this case, we'll be doing something similar, but it's more about you understanding a little bit of the context that we're talking about. Like, what kind of organizational scenario are we even talking about when it comes to this idea of transforming or reimagining power structures, and what the process, what a process might look like through that transition. Alex, you have your theater voice ready?
Me. So the organization we're going to be working with today is called Groundworks. Again, imaginary made up organization. Their mission is to create and maintain community green spaces in lower income and historically neglected communities. Their key programs seeks funding to purchase empty or neglected lots in and around the city and transform them into community gardens and recreational spaces. Their history: Groundworks was founded in 2009 by Nathan Richards, a former urban planner. The staff is made up of 36 people, is racially diverse, with the majority of director level positions held by people of color, all of whom report to Nathan. Additionally, the organization is composed of a large volunteer force that supports in the creation and maintaining of the green spaces. The particular scenario we are working with is that overall, the satisfaction rate and support for organizational leadership, including Nathan as executive director, has remained fairly high over the years. In 2015, a Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, or JEDI committee, was formed following the murder of 12-year-old Tamir Rice at the hands of Cleveland police. In the past year, now in the context of remote working, a pandemic, and the social aftermath of the uprising sparked by the murder of George Floyd, the JEDI committee held a community forum and attended by the entire staff, members of their volunteer force, as well as residents of the communities they work in. This forum resulted in a memorandum in which, among other things, said a white man should not be the leader of this organization. It pointed to a growing sense that important decisions were being made with the exclusion of the communities Groundworks was operating within, and that funding practices began to cross the line into exploitation of Black and Brown people. It mentioned that much of the language Nathan would use publicly was problematic and imbued with a sense of saviorism. The memorandum noted that this had been present and enabled for a long time by members of the organization, but that there was increasing realization that this kind of language and framing was doing real harm to the communities Groundworks was created to help. Lastly, some of the donors who supported Groundworks were investors who had not so secret interest in gentrifying the neighborhoods within which green spaces were being created. What followed was a tense time for Groundworks, in which the executive director began to distance himself from the staff. He became defensive and began making decisions unilaterally in a way he had never before. Factions began to form across and within racial lines. There were those who supported the memorandum and others who felt it was harsh and harmful. Ultimately, organizational leadership, the JEDI committee, and Nathan agreed that they had to reimagine how leadership and power looked and felt at their organization, but they didn't know where to start.
Thank you. So, we're asked folks just to sit with this for a moment. Where do you see things that might feel familiar? Where do you see things that might feel like you currently are a part of similar circumstances? I'm always thinking about what tensions come up for me when I, review situations like this. I know, Alex, you and I have both been in been part of organizations where this kind of tension was prevalent. I'd also ask you to consider, so often when these things happen, we can make them flat. We can create the protagonist. We can create the antagonist. We know what the conflict is. I think we can see here that this is complex. It's complicated. And it might not serve us to create an antagonist or a bad guy in the situation, right? We certainly can have nuance and important conversations around how we might want to restructure or reimagine what power looks like here as they are. But we never want to flatten people. We never want to flatten situations. There are human beings who are involved in the situation. And I think if there's any kind of, most important tenet for me for this work is to approach the situation as though there are human beings involved, which we don't always do. So we're going to walk through this framework for equitable and responsive transitions of power. That's why we're here. We're about what does it look like to design a process that leads us to an outcome that is values aligned, that we feel that we've decided, that we've named as having integrity, that's inclusive, that is led by collective, that might require external support, might not, but it is, again, about the process. This webinar is about what that process can look like. So we're offering kind of a 5-step framework, if you will. Alex told me that they would, do bad things if I said the word framework again. I do say the word framework a lot, and that is part of the work that we do. Framework. But the first part here is to pause and acknowledge. Oh, and the other thing I want to say here, I'm going to back up actually to say this. I meant to say this in my approach section. The way that True North thinks about this work, EDI work, is through the is framed by organizational health. And the way that we think about organizational health is very similar to the ways that we think about physical health, the health of the individual. So for me, when I am most healthy, I am balanced. I am deeply listening to my body. I am taking care of my body. I'm feeding my mind. I'm feeding my spirit, right? I'm in touch with my emotions. I'm balanced. And so a lot of the processes that we do for organizations and for our clients at the individual level and at the org level mirror one another, because we don't actually view them as vastly different. And so I want to offer that part of the work that we can do for the individual, and we do this specifically in a lot of our implicit bias work or our conflict transformation work. If we have a webinar for that in 2 weeks, we're asking, what does it look like to slow down our processes? Particularly because we know that human beings can default to fight, flight, or appease, or freeze when faced with conflict. And the resolving of the conflict becomes more important than our relationships. It becomes more important than our values. And so we want to recognize that this is primal. It's primal, it's real, it's a part of who we are. But as a so-called evolved species, we can create frameworks or processes or practices that have us slow down and ensure that we are being who we say we want to be. So that's what I meant to say that earlier about the approach section, Alex, and I forgot. So step 1, pause and acknowledge. What would it look like for the organization to take a breath and count to an org 10, if you will? Allow for things that aren't priorities to be pushed back if possible. Business as usual can't be the motto during times of tension. And we especially saw that this past year during COVID, and particularly at the beginning. And we didn't know what was going to happen, right? We didn't know if we should work harder, go slower. No one knew. But we did see a lot of, we got to just like keep working. And a lot of it was about that fight or flight. In times of conflict, we can make decisions that are not in the best interest of the organizational community or the individual, but in the interest of ending the conflict. So an operationalized pause can offer the time necessary to think, feel, and not be driven by urgency and avoidance of conflict. Alex, you want to offer some examples of that actually?
Oh, of the pause and acknowledge?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we brainstormed some ideas. For example, taking an organizational day off. We are all stopping work, right? Because this isn't business as usual. We need to tend to the heart and spirit of what's happening here. So taking a org-wide day off, creating a simple but anonymous survey to check in with what staff need in the moment, as opposed to assuming. And assessing where the organization may take a step back from work or various responsibilities in order to make intentional space for healing and the EDI work, right? We need to look at what is on our docket and what can maybe be pushed off for a later date because this is important. Not we don't want to focus from urgency, but we do want to make it a priority. After that pause, we start creating space for sharing and listening. The organization, with special attention to those most powered down, again, revisiting this triangle pyramid of hierarchy that we are accustomed to. We have the bottom of the pyramid where there's a significant amount of the organization being pressured on by those that hold power. So those who are most powered down requires a space that centers sharing and listening rather than exchange and debate, right? We are only listening. We are hoping to keep our mouths closed and our ears open to the best of our ability. Organizations, like much of our society, have a propensity for Socratic conversations and debate, but these forms of communication are often designed to prioritize the mental, intellectual aspect of us and deprioritize the physical and emotional. The consequence of which is that those who have been most harmed are silenced. And so when we are creating this space, we again want to make sure that we are making energy, space, time for those who don't normally get to have their voice in the room. And we also explore what have individuals experienced and what were the events and circumstances, organizational and societal, that led to the call for change. What is the impact, right? So it may be one particular incident happened that was a catalyst for everything, but we need to take a step back to look at what it was our story that led us to here, right? It wasn't just that one particular incident. There were likely many things that happened along the way to even get to that sometimes explosion that happens within organizational culture. And there's a variety of ways in which we can create this space for sharing and listening, different focus groups that can begin to unpack our actions and values that led to the current state of the organization, various restorative circles that start to set the foundation for intentional and holistic healing. We often intellectualize this work and forget that it's healing work too. So making sure that we're incorporating that. This is beyond taking anti-racism workshops. It's about healing what happened internally and societally as well. And thoughtful and intentional one-on-one interviews to gain a better understanding of how the current organizational culture is impacting people on an individual level. So we want to look at the collective and the individual and see where the overlap is and how it's connecting to the broader issues.
Thanks, Alex. And just a note, logistical note for folks, we're reading all of this inclusive of what's on the screen now, and the examples Alex is offering are in the workbook or the resource that we shared in the link. And Alex, it might be time to share that again, just for folks who may have entered late.
No
so
problem.
you can see these. Thank you so much. You can see these examples and this kind of the framework in the workbook. We didn't want to overload you too much with the words on the screen. So the next step in the process.
Rosie, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Yeah. Just one more thing also within that workbook that I think is really important that we're not going to be highlighting as much here is that there's questions for folks to consider along each step of this process, right? So when we are in the pause phase, when we are in the creating space phase, and the other phases we're about to discuss, we have several questions for either individuals or the collective to consider as they're moving through each stage of this process.
Yes, thank you. So I think the other caveat here is that, we are a consulting firm, and organizations, if this is kind of what they're going through, might bring us in at a variety of phases to support. And the reality is we could help support all the phases of this process. But but we do want to recognize that things like focus groups, things like circles, we do want to honor that there is expertise there. There are people who are skilled in practice in doing that work, and we don't necessarily want to be haphazard when we choose to do those things. So throughout all these processes, we want to, offer up that one of the resources at your disposal are outside consultants like TNEDI, and certainly expertise that lives within the community. But we always want to be aware of who are we asking to do labor and who are we asking to do free labor, and how can we ensure that we aren't reproducing old patterns of asking for free labor whilst going through this transition process. So the third part of this process is a values alignment. Okay, so we've done the work of asking what happened, who was impacted, what is, as Alex said, the story. My hand's getting huge here. What is the story, and where are we in this story, right? Once we go through that process, we want to begin to think about what values are present, and begin to clarify values, right? We talked about earlier, our work is around making the inside match the outside. So this is part of that process. When we are operating in fight, flight, or freeze, we aren't seeing each other. We're making assumptions, quick decisions about who people are and their intentions, and lead oftentimes with harmful biases. So again, even when we do kind of implicit bias at the individual level work, we're often asking, before we get to interpreting what's happening or the conclusions about what's happening, let's just take a moment to surface what values are at play. During times of transition or conflict, the distance between our values and our actions can become misaligned. Additionally, this process requires us to name those values we don't want to name, but are operating nonetheless. So there are implicit values that are oftentimes operating. Values like urgency, power hoarding, right? Those things that we know can begin chipping away at culture and certainly support white supremacy and inequity. So this process we're offering, this part of the process, this phase, is iterative and generative. And we're looking at organizational stakeholders to take what they've learned from the sharing and listening to get clear on what values are present or missing, what values are operating implicitly or explicitly, and what would it look like to align who we say we want to be with how we're being and who we want to be. So again, this is, for us, it's about slowing down so that we can begin, so that whatever it is ultimately that we create together has gone through this process.
Pardon me. I'm trying to find my place. And so some of the examples of what this part of the process might look in action is a voluntary or opt-in facilitated conversations led by a small group where staff who feel they have capacity and or desire to participate can further name the specific practices or instances that led to harm or tension within the organization. And we highlight voluntarily or opt-in because sometimes what we see is organizations find a tension in their values or in their organizational culture, and they're like, okay, now we all have to do professional developments and trainings and workshops, and it's all about consent, right? As Cardozi mentioned before, when people are having to engage in this work without consent, their input is going to continue adding friction and adding to those power dynamics and adding to those tensions. And so we want to gently move into this process and want to reach out to those who feel they have capacity and interest and passion around this. And when we look at the longer term of this work, looking at going back to what Cardozi was saying before, this is added labor for folks, right? So where are we restructuring our workload, or where are we adding additional compensation? There are a variety of things for us to consider when we're doing this work long-term. But as we're beginning, we're looking at who can voluntarily step in to start guiding us of how we can support our staff in the organization. And then beginning an iterative and generative process through which organizational stakeholders take what they've learned from the sharing and listening to get clear on organizational needs, next steps, and resources needed to be successful in meeting staff needs. So this is really an exploratory time for us to gather as much information as we can so that we can then put it into action, and actions that actually feel aligned with what we need rather than what we think we need or want.
Thank you. And again, this is, I think this is the beginning of like post-it craziness. Like if we were in person back in the day, which we are less now, but we'll move into more in the future. This is post-it palooza, sticky note palooza, right? We're looking at values, what's present, what's missing, what's implicit, what's explicit, and it's just imagine a room of that, right? Again, to really surface, to really let emerge or be revealed what's present. So the fourth part of the process here is desired future state. And this is language that is not uncommon organizationally. Organizations oftentimes use this as a framework to think about a vision statement, or a framework to think about, so many frameworks, sorry, Alex, a process through which they can think about vision statements or value statements. For this, where we are using this language here as a step. And so before we rebuild, we must reimagine and redesign. Alex, you said this the other day when we were talking about this. We don't want to rebuild what we just took down, right? But we do want to make sure that there is a value, that something has to be built in the place of what was present before. It might take up a smaller space, it might take up more space, it might be in a different direction, it might be completely new looking and fantastic, but something has to be rebuilt. But before we can get to the rebuilding process, remember, we're slowing down. We're offering a slow down. So I bet you can imagine an organization that where the memorandum comes out, and the next thing you know, we are saying, here's what we're going to change. That can work. That can work. We are of the belief that meaningful change comes through collective and inclusive processes. And so that is what we're offering here. So transitions ultimately lead to a new state. And the process leading up to this phase is meant to honor the needs at play during transitions. That's what we're offering you, right? A slowed down process is designed to honor the needs at play during transitions and during conflicts. During the desired future state phase, organizations consider what the desired future state of the organization will look and feel like, and what a values-aligned organization, particularly as it relates to how power operates, would be. So this is not yet about what new structures need to be in place. During this stage, we can consider the tools, resources, and skills. I think we always should kind of be thinking about that, like what skills do we have at our disposal, what resources can we leverage? So we can think about those things, but ultimately what we're leading to is the building or embodiment part of the process. This is not that part of the process yet, right? It is about, before we start to like take out the hammer and the screwdriver and the blueprints, what do we want this space to feel like? What do we want power to feel like here? Does it feel like my high school theater program? Does it feel like my mom and my titis who like are like all one collective voice sometimes and like manage to resolve conflict in ways I don't know how they do it, right? What are we looking to inspire us before we like begin kind of the brass tacks of building?
And something to highlight about this part is this is where we get to dream big, right?
Hey.
Sometimes we get stuck in this like capitalistic scarcity mentality where we're just like, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough people, we don't have enough energy, which might be very true. But this is where we get to say, okay, if resources were not an issue, right? If we didn't have to worry about money, people power anything. What do we want, right? This is Disney World. We can have anything, dreams can come true. And so that energy, that approach to it is very important, because sometimes we can really limit ourselves of what is possible. And it also just starts giving us insight of like, what resources do we need? And so when we're in this state, there's a variety of things we can do. We want to continue facilitating processes of small groups or various affinity spaces with all of our community members and stakeholders. We want to continue collecting feedback, identifying what the future of the org will look like and what values guide that transformation, start brainstorming what resources we need. It could just be money, but are there other resources that can lead to success in this work? And then becoming acutely aware of what success looks like in this work and as we continue to transition, and naming what tools will be utilized to measure success and what the accountability process will look like as we move forward in making our desired future state come true. Do you want me to close us out with embodiment?
Sure.
Cool. So this is the exciting part, right? The processes that we just discussed can take quite some time. But once we get through some of those difficult or challenging conversations and dreaming and brainstorming and all of those things, we can start getting into the embodiment, right? Putting our values, our ideas into action. And so the embodiment step is characterized by intentionality. Organizations consider the structure, systems, and practices that will embody and be aligned with the values and desired future state that has emerged through the process thus far. And I will also highlight that like our process will constantly be malleable and shifting and changing, because as we move along, we're going to recognize different needs that come up that we may not have realized before, right? So this embodiment part can also be just like very shape-shifty, a little wonky, feeling like a baby deer just born and like on your legs, like wobbling.
Nice.
So it can feel like that. And we are working towards something more solid and grounded, right? So the beginning stages of embodiment can feel a little wonky. The embodiment phase is not an overnight process. Building takes time if we want what has been built to be resilient and lasting. The foundation is all that has led to this phase. So the beginning part of this process is a lot of building foundation, and the embodiment is adding, the brick and mortar on top of that. Some of the work that can happen during this time is a community board or community members on the board with equal voting power. Right now, we see a lot of board members, usually more affluent folks, being able to have decision-making over organizations and communities that they might not necessarily even be a part of. We can see a partnership leader model where there are 2 or more leaders, as opposed to like a traditional executive director or CEO, each leader having a specific focus area or expertise. There's processes for collective or inclusive decision-making amongst the staff. So again, reshaping that pyramid that we are accustomed to and creating a different shape. Staff-led groups or committees that help bridge communications between the staff at large and senior leadership. And there are a plethora, I think, of ways that we can embody this, that there are more included in the workbook. But this is where we want to start seeing our people power in action with our staff, with our community members, with the constituents or people that we are serving in our communities, and where we start trying out different leadership models to help move our equity work in a more like inclusive and holistic manner.
Thank you, Alex. So I want to make sure we have enough time for some questions and answers. Again, I'm sure you're very surprised that in a 75-minute webinar, you didn't get all the answers. But I hope that you feel you were able to see what's possible or feel what's possible through a process that we hope is responsive. We hope that is inclusive and equitable, that centers community and that centers values as well. Alex, in the work that we've done, we certainly have seen areas of where change became possible or was embodied through this process. Sometimes they're macro changes, right? Like an ED steps down. And even in that process, so we have one client where the ED has decided to step down, not yielding, but deciding through learning, through conversations to cede. But this is an interesting one. They also responded to kind of a list of demands that particularly the Black, as a school, the Black principals kind of came together to create this list of demands. And so and not out of any kind of acrimony, just like here's what we think is important for our students. And so the ED, or superintendent in this case, offered that they'd be stepping down, and that they would step down whenever folks were ready, and they would go through the process to make sure that their runway was as thoughtful, as intentional, and as they collectively thought about who would replace them. And what's replacing them is a leadership council. So there will be kind of a figurehead, but decision making will happen in collective, about a group of 3 or 4 people. A funny part of that story is that once she announced that she'd be stepping down, some people in the Black principals group said, "Oh no, we didn't want you to leave." And so it's so interesting. And it wasn't, she's leaving. I think she feels complete with leaving. But what struck me as interesting is that leaving isn't the only option, right? When we talk about sharing, ceding, or yielding, to step aside or step down specifically is one of many options. And in the case of Groundworks, our theoretical organization, what was said was a white man should not be the leader of this organization. The values, when we look at the values under that, we see a value around representation. We see a value around historical power and what it looks like to disrupt historical power. But you didn't see the whole memorandum, but in our heads, it was never said that, Nathan, you need to step down, right? And so what does it mean for Groundworks to, again, go through this process and decide, hey, so what are the values present? That he should not be sole leader. So then what do we want to create? What does a values aligned embodiment look like? So always interesting doing this work. We're gonna pause here and make space for some questions and answers. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A. You should see a Q&A tab. And we'd love for you to write in any questions that are coming up for you, specifically around our experience in this work, recommendations we might have, and they will all be imperfect offerings in response to your questions. We certainly want to make space, though, for anything that's coming up for you, any questions you have. So feel free. What questions are there in the space today? This would have been useful to say at the beginning of the session, probably, right? So we'll give folks some time. So yes, feel free to use the Q&A form, though I see we do have chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, Alice, do you want to read that for me?
Sure. So we were asked, how do you help others on a board or staff understand the need for new leadership models?
That's a great question. So I think because the process that we offered up is, not a perfect one, doesn't even have to necessarily be in the sequence that we offered it. But the primary question is who we say we are who we're being, right? So does the current leadership structure align with our declared values and our declared beliefs? You might find, we don't even have declared values. Well, that's a place to start, right? That's even more slowing down. So I would say that it's less about convincing people to do a thing and more about allowing things to be revealed through a process that begins with values and where are we aligned and where we misalign and what would it look like for us to align, whether it's about the practices that we have, our power structures. But for me, it's been a more useful and meaningful first point of inquiry than I think we should change this thing because. Thank you, Paul.
So we have a question in the Q&A. It says, this is complicated to navigate in the Zoom webinar, so that's helpful to know. Thank you for sharing that. But we are looking forward to working with you in person sometime soon. There's too much to unpack right now, but your work is really impressive and I learned a lot from the last webinar. Thank you. It's not
Thank
a
you,
question,
Liz.
some love. In the chat, we have, how do you start to open the dialogue? So as far as it's like that's a difficult question, right? Because every organization is different, their needs are different, the tensions, or it doesn't even necessarily need to be tensions, awarenesses that they come to will all vary. And so I know that every organization we've worked with, what brought them to starting the dialogue has been very different. Some folks, it has been because there was an event that was a catalyst for saying, we need to prioritize this work. Sometimes, as Cardozi mentioned at the beginning, there's a call for action, right? Either the people we're serving or the staff that are helping us move our work forward are saying we are fed up or this is not sustainable. So lead to that. There's a variety of reasons why we go to the table to start having these conversations. And so as far as like starting the dialogue, that's why we start with like, how are you feeling? What is in your body right now, right? And how is this impacting you mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically? And going from there. And there's so many things that can come from there. But when I think addressing each individual as a human being is where we start, right? Because we need to look beyond that. We are just a organization that produces work, right? We are a collective of human beings that have feelings, that have needs. And so we need to figure out what those feelings and needs are first before we even get into the equity work. And that's why we talk a lot about the values, because we want to make sure that our values are feeling whole and affirming for the people that work within our organization and for the people that we are serving.
One of my favorite things in grad school, actually I hated it, but now I really appreciate it, Alex. We went to school, as I said earlier, in an applied theater program, and we did a lot of theater games and activities. We were like up on our feet a lot, and there were a lot of instructions on how to do the games. And our professors would give space for like 2 questions, but then at some point they're like, all right, enough questions, and we're gonna do it anyway, right? And you'll figure it out as we go. And sometimes in terms of like, how do we start? Really, it's just about, you just start, right? And disavow yourself or disavow ourselves of any expectation that the start will be perfect, right? We want it to be intentional, we want it to be meaningful, we want it to be safe and free of harm, but ultimately, no matter how you start, it will be an imperfect start. So sometimes just starting is important. So thank you for that question. Another question here from anonymous attendee. What are your thoughts about using social media to apply public pressure on an organization to make meaningful change? So for me, I'm all about, we have the tools that we have, right? Social media is a tool. In terms of Cardozi's decision-making processes, I'm always going to ask myself some questions before I make any decision, right? Am I somehow throwing other people under a bus? And by that, I mean like people who actually could get hurt by doing this thing, right? Who might that come back to in the organization that would cause a sequence of events that would end up harming vulnerable folks or marginalized folks? There's no easy answer to that question. I'm also asking, there's power, while there's power in social media, there's also power in, like, depending on who your body is, your body saying, this thing is wrong, I think that we need to talk about it. Now, of course, that ultimately is going to be correlate to the safety of your body and being able to publicly say anything, or if the org has a pathway for those kind of grievances or feedback. It might not. In which case, I can't ever say that any tactic is wrong, nor can I say any tactic is right. So I think it just has to be considered, where might there be harm for another person, for myself, And the reality is stuff can get done. We've seen a great deal of movement in the past couple of years, directly the cause and result of social media pressure. So there would be no world in which I could tell you that not to ever use that. But I do think we should use whatever tools we have with care and with thought. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
No, that was perfection. We have a question about rebuilding trust. How do we do this while working remotely? There's been a lot of folks talking about feeling disconnected from their work community because of the working remotely. And I know personally what I continue to bring it back to is intentionality. There are ways to build community virtually. As somebody who is disabled and chronically ill, if it was not for virtual community, I don't know that I would have much of one, right? And so there are ways, but it is about structuring it, making time for it, right? When we talked about pausing, stepping back, that we can not only meet in Zoom when we have work to get done, right? We have to come together virtually, in person, whatever means works for us, to say community building is a priority for us. Right. And there are a multitude. I think one of the beautiful things that happened in the last year and a half is there's been even more of a multitude of tools and resources that we can utilize beyond Zoom or in tandem with Zoom to work on that community building. Something we talk about is anonymous feedback, right? Whether it's Google Jamboard or whether it's Padlet, right? We utilize all these variety of tools and softwares to start gathering feedback. We can break into small groups and, start asking community building questions so that we're getting to know each other, right? If you have a large organization that's 100 people, we can get together and 100 people, but break into rooms of groups of 3 or 4 so that we can have more of that intimate setting, right? There are tools that we can leverage to help build that trust, build that community, but we have to be intentional about prioritizing, carving out time and energy for that. Like that, just not 10 minutes at the beginning of a meeting or, once a quarter. Like it has to be something that is consistent and something that is prioritized.
Yeah, I love that. That intentionality piece is key, and it comes up in the next question as well. But I think, just if I could add on to what you talked about, Alex, I'm always wondering, like, what does it look like to operationalize trust building? Right? We operationalize so many things. So much of it is so boring. So much of it is just inherited things that we just do because we were taught to do it when we got the job, or this is how orgs work. And they're not actually things that we need to even use time to do. Right? So much of that when we go through like audits with organizations, a lot of what results is, why do we even do this? This is so silly. Oh, we did it because in 1999, this thing happened, and then we started to do this process. Now we're still doing it 20 years later, even though the circumstances are completely different. So sometimes we have to like go through what we've operationalized and figure out what, to Alex's point in terms of intentionality, how do we operationalize trust building? How do we operationalize community building? Right. Let's put that into a list of priorities as you shared. A question here from Yuko. There is so much disembodiment in organizations. How do you bring folks into embodiment? What does intentionality look like? I think this is so important. When I think about embodiment, it means different things to different people. So I want to know what it means for you, right? And when I'm embodied, when I'm fully embodied, when I'm fully shown up, what does that look like for me? What does that feel like for me? So I'm curious, even as I read this question, if I were facilitating the space, this is what I want to know from the people who are present. What would it mean to be able to show up here embodied? If it just means being physically in a space, which I don't think that it does, let's talk about that. Let's figure out what that means. But I actually think it means something more in terms of how does what we create hold the values that we've surfaced. That's what I think about particularly the embodiment stage. It's right. This thing that we've created is a container for the values that have emerged, for the tensions that have emerged, for the whole process that led us to understanding what re-embodiment or embodiment might look like. And I think in terms of this question around intentionality, a little bit of I think about mindfulness, Alex, right? It's like when my eyes are closed, I'm asking, what is my intention? What's my intention for the day? What's my intention for the week? What's my intention for this webinar? And what does that look like at an organizational level? What is our intention here? What is our intention for having this meeting? What is our intention for having this particular process in place? What is our intention, right? And so just asking what intentions are present or what intentions we want to create, I think is one way for me that is what intentionality can look like. It begins with inquiry.
I think it's
Thank you, Yuko.
also about getting in that investment first from those most impacted, right? So that's one of the reasons why we said pause, slow down, start having these conversations, hearing people's voices and experiences, right? There are a lot of organizations that will start saying, we're going to start doing EDI work because this happened in our society or this happened internally. So we're going to start these workshops, we're going to start these trainings, we're going to go. And there's never been a check-in if staff are wanting, willing, able. They're just pushed into this. And Cardozi and I were talking a lot about consent and power structures, right? And so that is why it is so important before you get to the embodiment part that you go over the other stages first, right? And start having some of these conversations that are difficult conversations that bring up tension, start exploring our values, and start dreaming up what the embodiment will look like first. And when you have that in a collective and inclusive process and in an approach, people will have more buy-in because their voice is heard, their ideas are heard, right? They had some sort of input. Again, a lot of organizations will say, okay, we need to become more equitable, so we're going to do A, B, and C without any input from those who will either have to do the work or the work most directly impacts. So I think that intentionality comes from the beginning processes before we even get to embodiment.
Thank you, Alex. So we have one more question here in the time that we have. We have a big question in our like 2.5 minutes remaining. When we are getting to a point when orgs and some leaders are performative in words and not actions, how can we encourage leaders and leadership teams to examine power and oppression in a way that is systemic and not personal? So I'm hearing two questions there, or two kind of buckets of the question. I think performative, like virtue signaling and performative behaviors are very much just a part of people, right? If we're not actually rooted in our intention, we're not rooted in understanding of root cause, then what results is going to be performative. Or if we're lying, we're saying we believe this, even though this is how we act, right? So there's an inauthenticity there. So that's one thing for me in that. We have to accept that this will just happen. Now, if we don't want it to happen, I think that's when it comes back to what does this disrupting look like? How do we apply pressure in ways that feels values aligned and has integrity for us? This other piece for me about encouraging leaders to examine power and oppression in a way that is systemic and not personal. So that is a very specific paradigm that I think is useful, right? I actually don't care, about your feelings, right? This isn't about you being a bad person. You can be a good person and enact racist behaviors and racist decision making and racist policy. These two things don't need to be conflated. And certainly, I think in the process through which we're trying to convince people of things, it's not. No one learns when you think you're a bad person, right? All I try to do is to convince you that I'm not a bad person. And so this is just part of, for us at North EDI, this is one of our like fundamental tenets. Like this is actually about you being a good or bad person. A true north, as it were, is about making a decision from learning and listening and being present and constantly reworking that cycle, right? And then you make a decision, and decisions can happen moment to moment. And as X Kendi tells us, racist actions can happen moment to moment, and then anti-racist decisions can happen moment to moment. And if we look at the moments and the actions, it becomes less useful to get stuck in like the morality play of who I'm being. So I think that is part of what we do in the world. I think it does require some finesse and facilitation because we are so deeply committed to showing up as good people, and I will curse you out until you believe I'm a good person. Right? And so I think it's loaded, but it's also part of the work that we do. I want to close up. We have 1 minute left. I'm worried that we'll get kicked off. So I want to say thank you, Alex, and thank you everyone for attending. We will send you the recording, and we will resend the workbook. And as a consulting support, we are here if you need us. Alex, any final words?
No, just take care of you. Take care of your heart and spirit.
Yes, thank
And
you.
thank you.
Yes, and stay tuned for our 3rd and final webinar on December, I want to say 2nd, transforming conflict in the workplace, led by Kathleen Antoine Abiala and Aaron Levy. And hope to see you there. And thank you everyone so very much. Really appreciate you today.
Thank you so much, y'all.